Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to discuss about the core values and principles of community action initiatives. But before that, let us read the most essential learning competencies. Explain the core values of community action initiatives such as community rights, social equity, gender equality, participatory development, and assess selected community action initiatives based on its core values and principles. So, actively participating in our communities and responding to one's duty that demands a set of sacrifices can only be motivated by very significant mores that necessitate such acts of selflessness. Humanity in its early history has been preoccupied with its search for meaning. In its journey, people have been beset by good and evil sides of humanity. The dualism that is inherent in our existence is indicative of the struggle that we will have now. We left those simple communes of hunter-gatherers for the present complex society that is ever reliant and fragile. But we are the same people who still search for meaning and purpose in life. So, early history of rights. As the population in the communes became bigger, social structure were built around the roles of the members. This helped create social hierarchies that later on became the framework of political, social, and economic stratification of the members. These social classes then resulted in more structured differentiation among people while alienating classes deemed to be subordinate of lower in ranks. The social structure, particularly in politics and religion, ushered in the rise of monarchs that became the symbols of power and authority. Rulers such as kings and emperors claimed that they derived their right to rule from God, thus legitimized by their faith and reinforced by their people's belief of a higher being. So during this kind of rule, people was centralized and the privilege of people, such as having their rights protected by laws, were limited to a select few. As such, these rights were mostly reserved to those who were close to the ruler. So, not all rulers from the past, however, are the same. There were great kings who recognized the value of human life and the importance of protecting human rights while ensuring equity of opportunity in the kingdom. So one of them was Cyrus the Great, who ruled Persia from 600 to 530 BC. He freed slaves and gave the people religious freedom. This early example of social equity influenced some of the earliest and most influential civilizations, such as the Greek and Roman political and legal tradition that recognized social protection and equity under the law. So because of the existing political and economic hierarchies that supports these early civilizations, however, rights were not exactly equal among the members of the society because power was concentrated on particular social class or classes. So the barons who led the rebellion struck a deal with King John, resulting in the signing of a document now called the Magna Carta or the Great Charter, which specified laws, rights, and policies that was aimed at balancing the power of the king and protecting citizens from abuses. This document, however, was not universal, and the rights mentioned therein did not apply to the slaves who were considered properties during the feudal period. So after more than 400 years, another major event occurred. This was the enactment of the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This monumental document changed the way proper was shared between the church and the states, promotes freedom such as freedom of speech and election. The event inspired the American and French revolutions in 1765 and 1789 respectively. So the victor in both wars gained not only their independence but also some of their fundamental rights that would later become the American Bill of Rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen for France. So the emergence of international relations and human rights. The effect of the two wars that nearly eradicated half of the world both called for nations to unite. So and in those instances become the turning point in global affairs. First, after World War I, nations formed the League of Nations signed by 44 states during the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. This was the first official attempt in creating an international association that provides a forum for resolving international disputes and serve as the platform of diplomatic exchanges among nations. So the United States, despite being one of the first proponent of the League of Nations, later on chose not to be part of it because of the differences with the proposed covenant that ran counter to their stance of sovereignty. So despite not having the United States as one of its members, the League of Nations was instrumental in changing how international diplomacy was conducted forever. So the achievements of the League of Nations. So what are their achievements? Here are the list. Creation of an international court, creation of international bodies, policy disarmament, settlement of facts and treaties, aversion and arbitration of conflict, and renouncement of war, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So despite these achievements, the League of Nations failed mostly because of inherent organizational weaknesses, which the lack of support from the United States, and its failure to address collective security among others. So, social justice and the protection of rights. In spite of the United Nations Declaration, there are still atrocities that happen every single day in all parts of the world. So according to the international human rights advocates Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, there were still large-scale violations in over 160 countries that they have observed in the 2014. So some of that human rights violation was the war crimes and were carried out in 18 countries. Armed military abuses were recorded in 35 countries. Refugees were left homeless and have resorted to desperate means by using rafts to escape Syria and other war-torn regions, whereby an estimate of 3,400 people might have died. So unlawful imprisonment of individuals was evident in 62 of 160 countries. Discrimination policies against the LGBT were seen in the 78 countries. So, ilan lamang ito sa mga naging human rights violation. So dito naman sa Pilipinas, here in Philippines, according to the Human Rights Watch, our country has been a hotbed of human rights abuses in the same year, 2014. So the Human Rights Watchdogs has truly recorded and observed the following. So here are some of the violations of the Philippines. killing of media personnel, unexplained allegedly forced disappearances, alleged death squads against political targets, militants, environmentalists, tribal leaders, and civilians, police use of torture, unlawful arrests, and unjust trials against alleged criminals. So, some of that is the rights violation of the Philippines. Social justice in the status quo is a hotly debated topic. Its definition is relative to the context of its application and implications. The United Nations provided this definition of the term. Social justice may be broadly understood as the fair and compassionate distribution of the fruits of economic growth. The idea inherited in social justice revolves around fairness, accessibility, and inclusivity, which can be attained once the rights are served and protected by those in power. Such abuses intensify the needs for the people to be resilient in the face of adversity, vigilant against abuses, progressive in their vision, and accountable to their actions. These are the same traits that we have already discussed. So they help social justice advance equity and fairness to all humankind. So the human rights regime in the Philippines. Human rights are a very sensitive topic, especially in developing countries like the Philippines. Human rights violations are the systematic effect of deep-rooted institutional problems. So, the human rights regime in our country is the focus of the international community in the last decade due to a number of unexplained disappearances, questionable police practices, and various civil and political rights abuses. The creation of the Commission of Human Rights, or the CHR, in the Philippines is embodied in its fundamental law under Article 8, Section 18 of the 1987 Constitution. The CHR is mandated to secure the welfare of human rights in the country. Okay, let's proceed. Empowerment, advocacy, and participatory development. So, in this lesson, we will expound on community empowerment, advocacy, and most importantly, how to effectively reach out to the public and induce participatory development. So, the birth of community action. The very idea of community action originated in the United States during 1960s. It was the time when the U.S. was beset with social problems within communities in a post-war economy, such as problems in poverty, drugs, and crime, especially in urban communities and even in the suburbs. These were mostly concentrated in housing projects that later became haven for criminal activities and illicit acts. The U.S. government took initiatives to wage war not against another state actors this time, but with these social ills that have ruined lives, endangered communities, and destroyed properties. So the U.S. government, then under President Lyndon Johnson, enacted the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 that later became the focal point of community actions initiatives that were focused with emphasis on the protection of citizens. So this led to the implementation of several projects and programs that helped the state bring welfare to its citizens. So the basic community empowerment. The concept of empowerment is the driving force behind community development. Empowerment combines the idea of power relations between the communities into one concept. To empower is to provide capability, access, and support for individuals and groups to fulfill their goals. This when people in the communities take control of their lives that empowerment can fulfill its mission. This is possible through capacity building measures and the provision of the public needs and creation of opportunities to show their own potentials to be in the political, economic, social-cultural, technological, or environmental aspects. So the public sector and community empowerment. The public sector is fundamentally controlled by the government. As such, it has a very specific take on community empowerment, which is state-centric. The leading agency that ensures social community development is the Department of Social Welfare and Development, or the DSWD. It is the central government agency that is tasked to create welfare initiatives for the efficient redistribution of government aid to those in need. It is also mandated to deputize the police to enforce the law against violators and abusers of the minors. So the private sectors and community empowerment. So the private sectors also contributes to community development in various levels, ways, and processes. The private sectors is the division of our society that is not under government control. This sector includes private companies, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, people organizations, and other non-public collectives. The continued social development project is not simply the burden of the government. In this age of globalization and collaboration, the dividing lines between local and global and between private and public has been blurred by collective community actions program. So corporate social responsibility. Corporations are often depicted as power-hungry, profit and rent-seeking entities that only exist to exploit consumers and workers. They only cared profit more than anything else, even to the extent of exploiting their workers. Workers' wages were barely livable, work conditions were full of health risks, and the corporation themselves did not care about the community at all. But times have changed. Currently, corporations are now partners for social change. During the Industrial Revolution, workers were asked to work for more than 12 hours a day, and kids as young as 7 were employed to do tasks such as cleaning chimneys. These workers, young and old, had no choice but to work in these horrid conditions or suffer having no income. Workers simply did not have the rights they wanted and had no power to lobby for their needs to the business owners. Okay, let's proceed. Next is the social entrepreneurship and social businesses. The path of social entrepreneurship has been long and forthcoming. The world was on its heels in the 1980s, where companies roamed across the business landscape, controlling much of the agenda. It was also in the period where businesses formed new entities that challenged the established notions of a for-profit business. So as companies began to inculcate a new entrepreneurial paradigm that puts the people and the community first among all other goals, social entrepreneurship was born. So in other words, companies that were part of SVN began inspiring thousands to create value not only to the company but also to the society at large. Currently, the term social entrepreneurship is attributed to business establishment that cause social change through the creation and institutionalization of businesses that embody and ethically sound the value-laden approach to processes and procedures for the benefit of all stakeholders. So the B-Corp Movement. The transition from strictly for-profit organization to social enterprises and social business heralded another form of business model, and this is the B Corporation, or the benefit corporation. The benefit corporation is the type of for-profit corporate entity that includes positive impact of society, workers, the community, and the environment in addition to profit as its legally defined goals. Another set of pioneering entrepreneurs, J. Cohen Gilbert, Bart Holohan, and Andrew Casoy, set the stage for what is now one of the most disruptive business ideas today. So with the combined efforts of the three entrepreneurs, they created B-Lab, a non-profit organization serving a movement of people using business as a force for good. Okay, microfinance. So Dr. Muhammad Yunus quest for social change started in Bangladesh when he noticed the lack of the poor access to capital. He saw that the main problem of people and families across Bangladesh was that no bank was willing and able to lend money to the poor. The main reason is that bank will not lend to those who cannot give a definitive guarantee that the loans will be paid on time or at all, since the poor cannot give any collateral or assurance to pay. Dr. So Dr. Yunus vowed to remedy the situation by providing the poor an opportunity to have access to capital. He was started to lend money to the poor in 1976 with just $27 as a guarantor for 44 people. Being the guarantor, he signed all the necessary documents. Theoretically, Dr. Yunus' idea would not work since it was often assumed that the poor would not pay and were inclined to use the money in different vices. This, however, did not deter Dr. Yunus and his quest for giving financial access to the poor. So the participatory development, the public, private, and the community. The community traverses the public and private sectors as it is affected by any relational shifts in structure, policies, and institutions. The term participatory development first emerged in mainstream academic discussion with the release in 1983 of the book Rural Development, Putting the Last First by Robert Chambers. It was coined primarily in reference to the importance of participation from the grassroots for the better planning, executions, and review of community development projects. Putting the last first is indicative of the initial agendas highlighting community participation as the most vital step in engaging development and its core. Okay, let's proceed to the gender equality. The protection of women's rights and the fight for equity have long been an uphill battle. Gender equity has been a global issue as it traverses cultural, ethical, and historical differences among nations. From health, education, and reproductive rights, the welfare of women should be included in proactive policy directions and social acceptance. Protection of women's rights should be a universal norm, and the struggle for women can only be reinforced with proper education of people who understand and appreciate the concept of protection as empowerment. So the global structure of gender equality. There are still thousands of women subjected daily to abuse, maltreatment, and women's right deprivation, among other kinds of government or other kinds of violence. Given the differences on state policy, culture, and norms, there are states that have not internalized international norms such as human and women rights. Internalization of cascaded norms from international organizations such as The United Nations can only be effective once states have institutionalized such norms as local policies. For now, here is a rundown of all the issues regarding human rights according to the United Nations UN Women, the UN's arm that advances human rights and protections globally. Okay, local struggles for gender equality. The Philippines has been one of the most progressive countries in Asia that internalizes international norms and bridges them to local policies with focus on the protection of women rights and promotion of their welfare. With the enactment of Republic Act 9262 or the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act of 2014, the government finally consolidated a policy that protects women and child from abuses. The statute covers issues of physical, psychological, and economic abuses against women, as well as the protection of children's rights under the law. While it is one of the most important steps in advancing women's rights and welfare, our government needs more statutes to cover other needs of women, such as equity in education and reproductive health. Next one is the reproductive health. Reproductive health was one of the biggest issues in Congress and in the public forum during the deliberation of the Reproductive Health or the RH bill, which was introduced in the floor of Congress in 1988. Several politicians, faith-based organizations, and pro-life advocates lobbied against the bill, basing their arguments on the sanctity of life, effects of the promotions of contraceptives of the community, and their alleged negative effects to women. Supporters of the bill said that the RH bill supports the community by making reproductive health equipment accessible to combat childbirth and pregnancy mortality, HIV, AIDS, and unwanted pregnancies. In spite of differing opinions from various sectors, the Congress was able to push for reproductive rights with the enactment of Republic Act 10354, otherwise known as the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012. Next one is the human trafficking. Every year, thousands of women became victims of illegal trafficking or white slavery and other forms of sexual exploitation, pornography, sex tourism, and forced labor. To implement the legal structure that protects women in the status quo from these illicit activities, the government enacted the RA 9208 or the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003 and RA 10364, the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012. Still, it may be said that there is much to be done to protect women's rights, but it is pleasant to know that the state is actively taking steps in decentralizing its power to empower communities and sustain its initiatives. Together with local and international actors, it sets the agenda forwards with a much-needed support and momentum to make sure no one is left behind. And that's all for this week. If you have any questions and clarifications regarding our topic, don't hesitate to PM me on Messenger. Again, this is Mariela Rosario, your teacher in UMS 8. Thank you for listening. Bye!